Hi, I'm Bob Pasnau, and it's a pleasure to be speaking to you today to commemorate my College Professor of Distinction Award. Of course, it would be better to do it in person, but it's great to join you in any way that I can. I work on the history of ideas, and in thinking about the moment we're in history, I think back to what they used to say in the early Christian monasteries. There was a saying that those who are visited by men will never be visited by angels. And I think to myself about the last year where I've been visited by very few people indeed. And I wonder to myself, well, have I received any angels in exchange for this isolation? Not clear to me that I have, but in 20 minutes or so, I want to share with you some of the things I have been thinking about this year. And you can judge for yourself whether any of it's of any interest. As I say, I work on the history of ideas, the history of philosophy. I'm interested in the way, in the history of civilization, ideas have gone on certain sorts of paths, developing in certain sorts of ways, going around in circles in interesting ways, so that old ideas become new and new ideas go out of fashion. My first book was on the way the mind works, on theories of cognition in history. My second book was on a detailed investigation of Thomas Aquinas, a philosopher from the Middle Ages I'm particularly interested in. After that, I wrote a very long book, an 800-page book on the history of metaphysics. My most recent book was a history of our changing conception of knowledge over the centuries. And my current project is to think about human nature and the changing conception of human nature that we see developing through the history of philosophy over the centuries. I'm particularly interested in history of the theory of will, the way in which our thinking about will has evolved. Now, it may seem just inevitable and so obvious and natural as not even to bear much discussion that, of course, human beings have a will. And of course, the will is central to who we are. But this is an idea that developed at a certain period of time in the Middle Ages, uh, and was, when it developed, something novel, something new in the history of ideas. For us, it just seems unremarkable. We talk about weakness of will and strength of will. We talk about someone's force of will. We use these expressions in all sorts of ways. It's perfectly natural to us to think that what makes us distinctively moral creatures, what determines the goodness and badness of individuals, has something to do with our will, and of course, something to do with the freedom of our will, another phrase we just throw around as if it's inevitable. But as I say, this is not always the way human nature has been conceived. If you go all the way back to Greek antiquity, for instance, it's very hard to find anything like a conception of will. They really don't have a word in Greek that's naturally translated as will. If you read someone like Plato or Aristotle, there's no natural place in their theorizing where you can say, this is where their theory of will lies. People have taken the later theory of will and tried to kind of find a place for it in Aristotle, for instance, but it's not at all natural to see to find it there. It's something that has to be imposed on antiquity. It's really not until St. Augustine in the 4th century of the Common Era that you begin to find the theoretical notion of will developed in any sort of detail and given any sort of a central place in human thought. Now, Augustine, one of Augustine's most famous ideas, one of his one of his central ideas, is the idea that we human beings are fallen, sinful creatures, irredeemable except for the grace of God. Now, the place Augustine puts that sort of theorizing is precisely in the context of our wills. He thinks that our wills are bad. He thinks we're born with bad wills. We grow up with bad wills. Try as we might, we're not on our own capable of repairing these bad wills. And it's only by engaging with God, praying to God, begging God for some sort of grace, some sort of redemption, that we can do anything about that. So for Augustine, thinking about will and thinking about human freedom is intimately tied up with the role that he sees God playing in our lives. This raises the question, though, if we're bad, if we require God for any sort of goodness in our life, then to what extent are we actually free? This is a problem Augustine worried about in great detail. He devoted an entire treatise to the question of whether human beings have free will. He thought that we did have free will, but he's very, very limited in the scope of the free will that he allows human beings. Subsequent Western thought kind of goes down this Augustinian path, seeking freedom, but yet supposing that freedom's possible only through the assistance from God. And there's a tension here, and everybody knows there's a tension. There was a tension in Augustine himself. Augustine long struggled with how to balance these two things, our dependence on God and our sense that we're free and somehow responsible for our actions. How do you balance these two things? For centuries and centuries, this debate continued. At the same time, the debate was made more complicated by the place of medieval science in these discussions. Now, in the Middle Ages, at any rate for quite a while in the Middle Ages, the most sophisticated, avant-garde, far-reaching kind of focus of scientific research was in the Islamic world. When people talk about Western civilization during this time, it's something of a misnomer because, in fact, the Islamic world really is central to the development of the chain of ideas that comes out of antiquity and eventually makes its way into Europe. If you're looking at the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, it's really the Islamic world centered around Baghdad where the most sophisticated ideas were. And at this time, in that domain, the leading philosophical idea, the leading scientific idea, if you like, was that the project of the scientist, the project of the philosopher, is to understand the causes of the world in such a way that when you understand those causes, you will understand that things could not have been otherwise. That's the project of philosophy, and that's the project of science. Philosophy and science aren't very far apart during this time. They're really part of a continuous field of inquiry, the project of which is to figure out those causes that determine the way the world must be. Well, if that's what you think philosophy and science are trying to do, then that makes trouble for the conception of will as the source of our freedom. Because it looks like for the will to be free, the will can't be necessitated. It looks like the will must somehow be able to be free of the kinds of constraints that govern the rest of the natural world. So at any rate, it's natural to suppose. And this created yet another dimension of the conflicts over will and freedom that run through the Middle Ages. All of this comes to a head in Western Europe in the 1270s, and particularly at the University of Paris, which was the center of philosophical and scientific inquiry for the later Middle Ages in Europe. At the university in the 1270s, there were a series of condemnations of various doctrines. And among the condemned doctrines, very prominently, were a series of doctrines concerning freedom and determinism. In effect, what was condemned at the University of Paris at this time in the 1270s was this Islamic view that what happens happens of necessity once you determine the causes that make it happen. Philosophers, theologians, scientists at the University of Paris were told, you must not teach that doctrine. Why? Because it's incompatible with human freedom. It's incompatible with human responsibility. How can we be responsible if the choices we make are necessitated? This leads to a crisis in the history of philosophy, because this long history going back to Augustine of trying to balance human freedom against the role of God, then complexified by the influence of state-of-the-art science and philosophy coming out of the Islamic world, led people to think, well, what is the way forward then? How are we to understand the will? Here's precisely where the book I'm working on reaches its central area of focus. I'm interested in what happens next. What happens next is what's often referred to as the voluntarist movement, from the Latin word for will, voluntas. You get the notion of a voluntarist movement that begins in the 1270s and spreads out from there, that begins to treat the will in the way we now think of as characteristically modern. Our conception of will is very much the voluntarist conception of will. The way we think the will lies at the center of moral responsibility, at the center of our identity as human beings, that the will and the characteristics of our will is what defines us as the kind of people we are. These are all ideas that grow out of the voluntarist movement. For the first time, the will is made to be the center of human nature. And this is really the heart of my project, as I say. Now, it's a very complicated story. There are a lot of aspects to what the voluntarists try to do. And part of what makes it interesting is how it spreads out into culture and spreads out into science, spreads out into theology. So there's a lot of aspects to this so-called voluntarist movement. But what lies at the very core of it is the idea that the Islamic conception of causes as determining their effects, even if that's generally true, and even if in general that's a correct description of what the scientist is trying to do, it admits of an exception. And the exception it admits of is the case of the human will. And in general, any sort of will that any being possesses, wills in general, according to the voluntarists, are a special sort of domain where the ordinary necessitating principles do not apply. This means, says the voluntarist, that if you take a person and you put this person in a particular context and you ask that person to make a choice, our wills are such that you can hold everything fixed, hold constant all of the details so that there is no further explanatory story to tell about why a choice gets made. It's within the will's power to do one thing or to do the other. You can do the morally good thing, you can do the morally bad thing. You can go out for Indian food, you can go out for Chinese food. If you're in a pandemic, you may decide to take out. So that's the voluntarist conception of the will, that the will has this power for opposites, no matter what the context, no matter what the background, no matter the entire state of the universe at the moment where the choice is made. Hold fixed the whole universe, and the result is not determined. The result is open to alternative possibilities. And this, the voluntarists said, is the precise locus of human freedom, that we have this power within us to do one thing or to do the other in a way that's not constrained by any sort of outside influences. It's just purely an act of will that makes these choices. And that's where moral responsibility lies. Now, these views were put forward by people like John Duns Scotus, William Ockham. Those are the most familiar names. If those don't mean anything to you, I could tell you about more people, but the names just get steadily more obscure as I go. These folk were all pushing this kind of line as a way of understanding human freedom. At the same time, you get a pushback from more traditional authors who think that this newfangled conception of will just does not make any sense. Now, why would they think it doesn't make any sense? One kind of critique they make against this conception of will is that it's just incoherent to think that we could have within us some kind of power that just spontaneously does one thing or does another thing. I mean, where else do we find that? What is that like? How would that work? What would the mechanism be? The natural world just doesn't work that way. And you can say, well, the voluntarists might say, well, this is something outside the natural world. It's as if we have this supernatural power within us. But the critics of the voluntarists say, call it natural, call it supernatural, whatever you like. It's unintelligible that there could be a power like this that could just spontaneously do one thing or do another thing without any sort of explanation. So the criticism first is that this is unintelligible. It makes no sense. Right behind that comes a second kind of criticism, though, which is that even if we could make sense of the voluntarist doctrine and this notion of a completely spontaneous act of will, it wouldn't actually do the sort of work we want it to do, because the criticism goes, it wouldn't actually explain why we're responsible for the choices we make. Here the thought is, look, granted the voluntarists have an explanation of a sort, at least they have an explanation for why it seems like we're free to do the good or do the bad, and it's something that's the product of our choice. Still, where's the responsibility there if the only story about why we choose one thing or choose another thing is that there's just this spontaneous, inexplicable zig in one direction or zag in another direction? Why should I feel specially responsible for that? That just seems like randomness. That just seems like a whim that comes out of the blue that doesn't actually say very much about me as a person at all. I might look at what I've done and think, wow, that's really interesting that I did that. I don't know why I did that. That just seemed to come out of the blue. Am I responsible for that? Well, I guess, but I don't really identify with that choice. I'm not even sure why I did it. It's just this random act of will that popped out of me. If that's the way things are, it doesn't seem to explain moral responsibility. And what's more, it doesn't even really seem to resonate with our own experience of ourselves. We act for reasons. At any rate, in cases where we were prepared to take responsibility for what we've done, we think, well, I did it for a reason, and maybe it was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done it, but at least I can understand why I did it. The voluntarists seem to want ideas to come out, they seem to want choices to come out of nowhere. And a lot of folk regarded that as objectionable. But the voluntarist program was wildly influential. And as I say, it had ramifications all throughout philosophy, science, theology, culture, and it responded to a real need in society at this period to give a sort of a robust place within us to the kind of responsibility that we take ourselves to have for the things that we do. Now, what happens next in the story is that the voluntarist program, I've been focusing on the case of the human will, but the voluntarist program applies as well to wills of all sorts, as I briefly mentioned before. If there are angels, it would apply to the will of angels. And so we can talk about why did some angels fall and become devils and other angels adhered to God and remained good. We can ask those kinds of questions. We can also, though, ask ourselves whether God has a will of this sort. And for the voluntarist, the answer is certainly yes, that God has the freest of all wills, that God's will is completely unconstrained, and that anything that's possible, anything that's even logically possible to do, God can do. God could choose to do if God so willed. So this is a kind of wide open freedom that gets applied to God, and it gets applied to God with interesting sorts of implications. One kind of implication comes in ethical theory. You know, of course, about the Ten Commandments. You know about various, biblical and non-biblical rules of conduct that we take ourselves to be governed by. For the voluntarist, these rules come from God. But since the voluntarists think that God can do whatever God wants to do, the voluntarists also think that God could change the moral law. God could subtract one of the 10 commandments. God could add an 11th commandment. God could inverse one of the 10 commandments so that stealing, instead of being bad, stealing becomes good. It becomes obligatory to steal. The voluntarists thought that if God wanted to, God could do that. There would be no contradiction. The voluntarists also thought that God could save whomever he wanted, could damn whoever he wanted. If God decided that, all of the people who followed the 10 Commandments should be damned, God could do that. If God decided that all the people who break the 10 Commandments should be saved and given eternal life in heaven, God could do that too. Here again, God's will is so absolute, so unconstrained by any sort of outside considerations, that you create this kind of wild scenario in religion where we don't exactly know what God might be thinking and how to understand our relationship to God. And we don't know how to conduct ourselves because we have very little access to God's will. This sort of tendency in the voluntarists makes its way through subsequent centuries. Remember, I said we were in the 1270s when this started. It runs through the end of the 13th century, all the way through the 14th century, into the 15th century, into the 16th century. When you get to the start of the 16th century, this tendency gets set out in its most radical, revolutionary form by Martin Luther. Martin Luther takes these voluntarist ideas, but focuses on the story about God. And Luther concludes that when it comes to our relationship to God, we as religious folk, our relationship to God is such that we don't know what it is we're supposed to do. We don't know what sort of works will save us. We don't know what God's policy might be about who God will save and who God won't save. Uh, these things are a complete mystery to us. Inevitably, they're a mystery to us. All we can do, Luther said, was to have faith that we will be fortunate enough to be one of the chosen few. We can't count on any works that we might perform to save us. We can't count on any works even to be good actions. For that matter, only God is capable of truly doing good, Luther thought. So all we can do is trust in the Bible, have faith that the teachings of the Bible will lead us in a way that God will find acceptable. Luther embraces the old Augustinian tradition, according to which only through the aid of God are we capable of doing anything that's worth doing. Um, and Luther magnifies that sort of thought to such an extent that, according to Luther, we simply do not have free will. And this is one of Luther's most notorious ideas. In contrast to the whole previous history of Christian theology and philosophy, Luther flatly denies that human beings have free will. And this creates a very strange situation now at the end of the Middle Ages, coming into the Renaissance. It creates a very strange situation. The voluntarist movement had been an attempt to humanize philosophical inquiry, to humanize the conception of human nature, so that human beings are put at the center of moral theorizing. Our capacity to act freely is magnified in such a way that we become important autonomous agents in the world. Agents whom God looks down on and God approves of or disapproves of, but the responsibility for the voluntarist lies within us. It's an important step on the kind of gradual path in the Western tradition to an increasingly humanistic attitude to human beings in their place in nature. With evangelical theologians like Luther, the so-called reformers, though I'm hesitant to call them reformers, given the kind of views that they put forward, for them, these sorts of voluntarist moves, because of the way they're applied particularly to God, serve in fact to undermine human autonomy, to undermine human freedom, to take away from the significance of our place in the natural world. It's an anti-humanistic move that develops in the Renaissance. And so it's really the later Middle Ages that are the champions of a humanism that then evangelical Christianity pulls back from. And it takes several centuries more and the Enlightenment of the 18th century before the humanistic path that philosophical inquiry had been on is restored, and that human beings again take a central place in our understanding of the world and our understanding of the relationship between God and God's creation. That, however, is a different story. And I think we're close enough to the end of this pandemic that I'm not going to get there anytime very soon. But I hope in time to be able to look ahead to that next chapter in the history of ideas. But for now, that's where I am. And thank you for listening.